This is the second generation Eljer Dover urinal that's been around since at least the early to mid 1960s and was made up until circa 1994. Like the third generation, this is definitely one of the coolest and most unique urinals I've ever seen. But how well does it work? Well, let's find out. For starters, the overall design is pretty much the same as the third generation. It's very plain. And not much else to say. The trapway opening is bizarre to say the least. You got this little area where it drains down into, and then you just got this circular opening, and that's pretty much it. As far as I'm aware, I don't think it has a siphon jet, by the looks of it. Because there's definitely not one on the side. Let's have a look at a flush. This particular one definitely has a pretty crazy flush. Functionality wise, this urinal is pretty to say the least. This thing does not seem to have a siphon jet, and considering that it siphons out kind of weaker because of it, I don't really see this thing draining all too greatly. But I will say though, despite that, it definitely has a very cool design, but at the end of the day, does it entirely matter when it comes to functionality? Not really. I definitely think this thing could have done with a siphon jet like the third generation did. Let's have a look at ball rinse. Here's a strange oddity I noticed with this one. Now, I don't notice this with others, but with this particular one, some of the rim jets don't work too well. I think they might be blocked or something, so I'm not going to entirely fault it. But generally speaking, you can also notice that some of the rim jets are kind of janky looking. As you can see, they kind of squirt to the side. Now, the third generation has a problem to where the siphon jet can be overpowered and it can spray over the rim that way. But with this particular one, it's got some pretty janky rim jets. I don't know if all of them have it, but the quality definitely wasn't the greatest. But this particular one's an 80s, so quality was pretty mixed during this timeline. But I will say, outside of some of the problems with this particular one, the ball rinse is pretty excellent. And I believe there are some front rim jets too. Indeed there are, so that's definitely a bonus. Like the third generation, it does have front rim jets, as you'll soon see. So that is a nice bonus. And that is the second generation Eljer Dover urinal. Definitely one of the coolest urinals from the time, but functionality wise, it definitely could have been a little bit better. This thing definitely has some pretty cool ideals thrown into it, but not all of it works out in its favor. I definitely think if this thing had a siphon jet, it would definitely be a lot cooler, and would probably work better too. But let's grade it.
So the overall design of this urinal really isn't anything too special until you look on the inside. That's where all the interesting factors come in. It's weird that they decided to go with a sideways trapway, especially considering that it's completely different compared to the first generation. It was a very interesting take, and because of that, I have to give it a 7. I'm going to be honest here, the flush really isn't all that great. It's very boring for a siphonic urinal, and not to mention that it's not very siphonic at all. Only when it's medium or high pressure will it ever siphon out, and it's very short. I'm going to have to give this a 5. Like the successor, the ball rinse is excellent on this urinal. Yeah, sure, the rim jets are kind of defective on some parts and the quality control really wasn't that great, but it does have an abundance of ramjets that covers most of the areas pretty well. So, like its successor, I'm giving it a 10. While the design is cool and all, the functionality is not so good. This has to do with two factors. One is the lack of a siphon jet to clear out the bowl, and two, the sideways trapway. The sideways trapway was pretty gimmicky and very Eljer, which explains why it was only done by Eljer only, because it just doesn't work. Now they did slightly improve this in the third generation, but it still has its drawbacks. This is also one of those urinals that has to be kept in the middle in terms of pressure, otherwise it will not be very good. If you lower the pressure, it won't siphon out. If you overpower the urinal, then you'll have a chance of some of the defective ramjets squirting outside the bowl, which is definitely not something you want in a urinal. This just shows why the sideways trapway thing was a poor idea in general. Yes, it's cool, but it just doesn't work as a urinal. So I'm going to have to give this a 4. Now let's talk about the overall value of this urinal. While yes, it's a very cool design and it does have excellent rinse, everything else just doesn't work. The lack of a siphon jet and a sideways trapway is just too gimmicky and it just doesn't work at the end of the day. And this urinal for a siphonic urinal is also not very siphonic. Not to mention the lack of a siphon jet also doesn't help clearing out the bowl that well. So you're left with something that's not very siphonic with a sideways trapway that just doesn't work. Yeah, it's a very interesting design, but in terms of functionality, it just doesn't work that great. That being said, I'm kind of shocked they kept this design for over 30 years before they finally added a siphon jet. And even with a siphon jet, it is slightly improved, but it's also still very gimmicky and has its drawbacks. I've discussed this in my third generation Eljer Dover review. In comparison to the third generation, this design is just inferior. I have to give it a 5. The final score of the second generation Eljer Dover urinal is a 31 out of 50, which translates to a 62 out of 100. I can appreciate the interesting designs this urinal goes for, but the poor features in this urinal, not to mention the sideways trapway, just doesn't work. In comparison, I prefer the third generation Eljer Dover a lot better. Sure, it still has its problems, but at least it slightly improves some of its problems, even if it does add some slight new ones. This urinal definitely had its potential, but the sideways trapway just doesn't work at the end of the day.